Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Dr. Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. His latest book, Feeling Great, contains powerful new techniques that make rapid recovery possible for many people struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Burns is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Very well said, David. Hello, and welcome to our listeners around the country and around the world. This is the Feeling Good podcast, and this is episode 357. Before we dive into our really special podcast, let me read an endorsement that's short and sweet. Whoops, I turned my computer off. Why did I do that?
It was short. It was so short I didn't even hear it.
Well, this is somebody wrote, and I love it when people go back to the beginnings of the podcast, and someone, Moshe, listened to podcast 45, and that's called More on Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, Cognitive Flooding. And he wrote simply, "This is a fantastic podcast. I can't get over it."
Well, that's it?
That's it. Short and sweet.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that kind comment. Today, we're going to have a little different kind of podcast for you. It'll be one that I recorded at my Tuesday night training group, and it has to do with my experiences in Palo Alto and Stanford when I was a Stanford medical student in the late 1960s. And a lot of you know that was kind of the hippie generation of kind of LSD and turning on, and it was an amazing and magical era. And my Tuesday students wanted to hear some of the stories of the 60s, and so I made a list of them, and then one evening I told about half of the stories, and if anyone likes them at some point, we could probably do the rest of the stories. But some of them are very very emotional and tearful, and some of them are a little bit on the racy side. There were some photos from a happening that I made happen, but they have full frontal nudity of men and women. It was called I was making a movie called Uptightness. And I'm not going to. I gave the people the ability to turn off, to leave the group if you don't want to see these photos. They were at the end, and they were taken by actually a world famous photographer, one of the top, if not the top photographer of the 1960s, a brilliant young photographer at the time, Larry Keenan. And I found them on his website. They're amazing photos, and I'll put a link to his website in case you want to see them after you've heard the podcast. But I'm revealing a very personal and very different sides of David, and I hope you enjoy them because I think that storytelling actually can have a therapeutic value. And so tonight is a whole evening devoted to storytelling, and make sure you give me an email and let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, and perhaps you'll lose all faith in me after you hear about what a wild, terrible medical student I was. But oh well, that's
or maybe they'll love you even more because you're so real and vulnerable.
Yeah, that would be nice. But
and
anyway,
David,
let's
are you
go.
Are you going to include a link to those cool pictures?
Yeah, I'm gonna. They won't be exactly to those pictures, but to Larry Keenan's website, it's all photos. So you'll see Bob Dylan and all kinds of famous people from the 60s, but those photos are featured there, and I'll see if I can direct you to some of them. Like the one of them called "The Kiss" was a very famous photo taken out at the day I had this happening. Was a friend of mine, Spider, and really a neat young guy that we were friends, Jeff Evans, and it shows him kissing this gorgeous young woman in a field of flowers, and you see me riding nude with 4 people on a motorcycle, and all kinds of crazy, wonderful things
and that's
that
a
went
great
on
picture,
that
by
day.
the way.
Huh?
That is a really great picture.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah. It was fun. They were fantastic days. There was magic in the air, and it was very real and very profound and very powerful. They were some of the happiest and best learning days of my life.
Nice. Okay, thanks. Enjoy.
Okay. Bye-bye. Here we go. So at any rate, in this first story from the 60s, although I have trepidation, all of a sudden it turned into an encounter group at Rob Christ's house with 6 or 8 people. And I wasn't that familiar with it, but the idea behind it was that people are basically pretty phony, and that we have this false front that we put on to impress other people and to the person we're trying to project who we are. And then there's our real self. And in psychodrama and encounter, people sense your phoniness just like in a flash. I don't know how people got so good at that. And then they confront you and rip you to shreds. And the idea is to get you to quote, crash, to start crying and open up and show your vulnerable side. And then if that happens, then they hug you and embrace you and might toss you in the air and things like this. It was very, very dramatic, and for many people, life-changing. But the group suddenly just turned on me, and they just started ripping me to shreds and attacking me ruthlessly. And I didn't know what to do. And it went on for a good, hour and a half. And and then this encounter group was over, and I was just feeling devastated and destroyed. And then all the group just jumped up. They seemed as happy as could be, and they went into Rob Christ's kitchen to cook some mushrooms that they'd picked. They weren't psychedelic mushrooms. They were just eating mushrooms, and they were all excited. I was just sitting there feeling incredibly dejected. And then Rob came up and put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Is there something wrong, David? You look like you're really feeling down." And I said, "Well, yeah, I just got ripped to pieces by the group, and I'm just feeling terrible. I'm feeling ashamed and kind of inadequate, and I just feel awful." And he says, "Well, David, sometimes it seems like you're trying so hard to impress people, and I think it turns people off. And when you're feeling like this, when you're feeling down, I just want you to know that I feel so much closer to you right now." And I could not believe my ears, what he said to me. And that's something we experience almost every Thursday, certainly every Thursday when we do personal work. And there's nearly always someone in the group who's feeling inadequate and ashamed and hiding something that you just think everyone's going to shoot you down when you show your true self. And then you find out the opposite. And it was a lesson that I've been learning in many ways throughout my life. But I later came to call that phenomenon perceived perfectionism, the idea that you have to, earn people's love or warmth or admiration. And so that was, a really good experience for me. And then I got interested in psychodrama. There was this guy named Hussein Chung who was described himself as short with bilaterally deformed hips. And I guess he'd always been a total outcast growing up, but he somehow evolved into this giant of a guru, and he started something called the Human Institute, where they would do 48 and 72-hour marathons that involved extremely intense version of that encounter group, and they would involve about 30 people, and people would take turns going into the middle, and then they would kind of do this number on you. One person would get behind you and would speak for your subconscious mind, the things that you were thinking but not saying. They seemed to know that stuff, and they would confront and challenge the person's phoniness until the person finally crashed. But crashing meant crying, and I had a trouble crying ever since I was like 8, because I was in a summer camp in the mountains in Colorado, and I was guarding the infirmary. It was this military organization that I joined. It was like paramilitary, really. It's, instead of the scouts, you learn to shoot guns and drill and be ultra disciplined. And at night you had to go on guard duty, like walking through the forest, guarding a certain section of the camp and stuff. And I was sitting outside the infirmary, and I realized that they had forgotten to change the guard. And it was getting dark, and been sitting there for 4 hours, and it was cold. And I was 7 or 8 years old, and I got scared, and I saw 2 men walking, and I started crying, because I thought, well, they'll notice that there's something wrong, and they'll tell me I don't have to sit here any longer, and I can go to my tent and go to bed. But they were very angry, and they took me into the into the kitchen or something where they prepared meals, and they said, should we whip him? And then the other fellow said, well, I don't know, maybe we should give them a break. And they said, well, you're here in this camp to learn that you're a man, and men don't cry. And if you cry again, we're going to whip you. And after that, I just lost the capacity to cry. And that's what you had to do in psychodrama. They were confronting me, and I was just getting uptight, but I couldn't open up. And then a friend, Jim Boyers, who was a psychologist, he's now a psychologist locally, and he was a psychology student at Stanford at the time. And he was a friend, and he got up behind me, and he put his arms around me, and they had lights and music. It was very dramatic. And when they thought you were about to crash, they would play some music that they thought was speaking to you, and they had this Nights in White Satin. You know that music it's a real famous 60s song by Moody Blues or something. They started playing that, and he started squeezing me around the stomach, and then I just started sobbing. And then there was this great kind of relief that I felt, and it was just a joy to be able to cry again. And then an odd thing happened, that as I was looking around the room at the people, and I saw this woman, and I started sobbing again, because I saw radiation marks on her face. Like at Stanford, when people were getting radiation for cancer, they would put like this purple dye on the part of the body so that they'd know where to direct the radiation. At least that was my understanding of it. And I saw she had that on her face, and I just started crying, because I thought, this woman is dying of cancer. And so the one of the psychodrama leaders says, what are you crying about? And I said, I think this woman is dying of cancer. And it was just so sad. And then she said, no, I don't have cancer, but I am dying inside. And then she started sobbing, and the mark disappeared from her face. I guess it was a kind of visual hallucination or something like that. But I experienced, what it's like to be opened up. And I began to see the tremendous difference between our emotional real self and that hard surface that we so often have, and how there is so much suffering in the world, and we're unaware of it, and that if you could just be opened up like that, you might be kind of crying all day long, just looking at people and being aware of the suffering that they're hiding from everyone. And then at the next marathon I went to, at the beginning, people would introduce themselves, and I became an intern. I did a 6 weeks internship in psychodrama, and it seemed like the real thing compared with medical school. It didn't seem to have much to do with human beings or enlightenment or suffering or anything like that. And at the beginning of a psychodrama marathon, the people would introduce themselves. And there was this fellow who said he was a Stanford psychology professor, and he sounded very pompous and said he was coming to the marathon to, observe and offer his expert knowledge about human psychology. And I said, boy, that guy, he's going to be in for a hard time here, because he's about as phony as a wooden nickel, and people are going to rip him to shreds. And sure enough, that happened. When his turn came, he tried to sound important, or, make some kind of comment about the psychology that was going on or something. And they just started ripping into him. And they said, who are you really? Stop trying to fake us out. Tell us who you are. And then he started sobbing and said, my only son committed suicide last week. It was so sad and so moving, and there was all of that going on inside of him. And the neat thing about the marathon, so they would find that part that people were hiding, but it was reckless. The people who were directing them were, I think some of them were ex-cons or something. They were like street thugs more than, they weren't experts or something, but they knew human nature, and it was kind of an amazing experience. So those are a few psychodrama stories, and kind of the things I learned from psychodrama. There are a lot more stories, but what was that there's this inner self that people have, and the outer show that we're kind of putting on all the time, and trying to, so people will think we're good enough or smart enough or whatever enough, and also that people can change quickly, because Stanford was into psychodynamic and psychoanalysis, and taking years to make small changes, and in psychodrama people made enormous changes within 20 or 30 minutes, nearly 100% of the time. But it was too powerful, and I heard that sometimes after a marathon, someone would end up in the Stanford inpatient unit, maybe someone with borderline personality disorder, who would disintegrate after the marathon. But at the end of the marathons, everyone would be really in a state of real joy, real ecstasy. And so it was just one of the many things that were going on during the 60s, and I learned a lot from it. And one of the techniques, the first cognitive therapy technique I created, is externalization of voices. And to this day, I'm pretty sure it's by far the most powerful of all the cognitive therapy techniques. And that was really something that came to me in the early days of going to Beck's weekly seminars when I was a psychiatric postdoctoral research fellow, and beginning to learn about cognitive therapy. And Beck had a lot of good techniques. He was very smart, and I learned a lot from him. But a lot of the techniques were and still are pretty dry and boring. And they weren't emotional, they weren't dramatic, they weren't charismatic, like examine the evidence. Well, there's value to that. Or the experimental technique can be very powerful. But for many people, they weren't, getting to the emotional level. And so the externalization of voices is actually very much like psychodrama, but with a safety net. And we're using the patient's own thoughts to attack them, and then doing rapid role reversals to show the person the way to enlightenment through, which is often through acceptance rather than pure self-defense. But that, as well as the belief that people can change rapidly and dramatically, is also something that I, to this very day, I take with me from those psychodrama days. And it's an unpopular point of view with many mental health professionals who are very committed to long-term treatment and slow, venting and exploration of childhood and things of that nature. But anyway, that could be like chapter 1 of our excursions tonight, and other excursions will be radically different from this one. But why don't we see if there's some Q&A? I think, Sean, you've got your hand up.
Thank you for sharing those stories. I know often when I see, cognitive behavioral therapy books, I know you're often credited for the downward arrow technique. I was just wondering, how did that technique come about? How did you create that?
Actually, it came to me on a bus ride. When I was in high school, another fellow and I hitchhiked from Phoenix to New York to attend a student body convention for national student. He was the president of the student body, and I was the president of the student senate. And he said, "Let's go to this national convention." And I said, "We don't have any money to get there." He said, we'll just hitchhike." And so we hitchhiked, and he was kind of into promotion. Bob Smellick was his name. And he was a really nice guy. And every town we went to, we'd go to the newspaper, like the Denver Post, and say, "We're meeting America." And then they would take our pictures and do article about this adventure, which was cool. But I just remember on the way back from the final leg of the return home was from Flagstaff to Phoenix, and I was on a bus or something. I can't remember, but I started thinking, when someone upset, I started saying to myself, "Why is that upsetting to you?" And then if so, why is that upsetting to you? And it all came to me at that time, but it didn't reemerge until years later when I was, doing cognitive therapy. It was all about changing people's thoughts. But I thought, what if we, instead of going across the horizontal arrow from the distorted thought to a positive, undistorted, helpful thought, go down and see what's really bugging them. Why is this so upsetting to you? What are you so afraid of if you fail? What's the worst that could happen? Well, then people would not love me because I'd be a failure. Well, write that down, and if that was true, why would that be upsetting to you? Well, then I'd be entirely alone, and then that doesn't sound very good, but what would that mean to you? And so, well, I could never be happy if I was alone. And then you can see the self-defeating beliefs, approval addiction, love addiction, achievement addiction, things like that. And then once I got that one going, I heard that Albert Ellis had something a little similar for anxiety called the what if technique. So I added that to the arsenal and beefed that one up. And then when I got to working on relationship problems, I developed the interpersonal downward arrow in 1980 that led to the rules and the roles. And one thing is that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and I have tremendous weaknesses. But I think one of my strengths is creativity, and even to this day, I create new techniques almost every day, and that's been a really fun thing for me. Kai.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing everything. I was very moved by when your tears returned, David, both in the story as well as in real time as well. you're so used. I'm so used to seeing you helping other people, bring other people to tears, help them bring those tears up. So it's always a gift to see you have that for yourself as well. So I wanted to ask you, in Rob Christ's group, you mentioned that they had tore you apart. What specifically did they say to you at that time, that kind of
Boy,
tore
I
you
can't
apart?
remember, but psychodrama was all about challenging people and ripping through their defenses and not allowing them to sound kind of phony, challenging
Mm.
people. I'll try to remember, because it's been a long time since I've done it. I think if I could do psychodrama, I think, like one technique, I actually used it in the Tuesday group on a couple of occasions, to when someone was having trouble saying what was bothering her. I got up and said, right, I just got behind her and started talking for her, because I knew what was bothering her.
Oh,
And that kind of opened her up. But it was like saying what like someone would become your alter ego type of thing and say the things that you were hiding.
yeah.
And it was fairly aggressive too, but there was also beautiful music. It was all designed to be a very emotional experience, and it was. It was controversial, probably deservedly so, but it was amazing. And people would go to these the Human Institute on Friday nights for a demonstration with Hussein Chung, and it was always mind blowing. And then they even in Palo Alto on University Avenue. There was the Mid Peninsula Free University, and they had a kind of a theater there, and there would be live encounter groups. You could go, and someone would be, being confronted and challenged, and would have a life-changing experience. And people just loved to watch that and participate in that. And I think that's one of the attractions of this group, is not just to learn psychotherapy, but to experience and observe the rapid transformation of people, and to get people to a state of enlightenment. What happened to Rob was kind of sad, though. He everyone had their own kooky approach to enlightenment, and he was into something called a Kundalini yoga, or something, like it was some extreme form of yoga. And he really wanted to have out-of-body experiences and connect with the other world, the afterlife, or whatever. And he developed this method. He had a bathtub in his yard that he would fill with ice and water, and then he would get into the bathtub in his house and heat it up until his temperature went up to 103 or 104. And then he would go out and get immediately into the ice cold water. And that would kind of set him into, some experience of astral traveling or something of that nature. And he got a lot of people, including Stanford professors, to come and try it. And he thought he was really onto something. And perhaps he was. But then he got into wanting to make it more intense. And so he got a container of laughing gas. And so when he'd go into the ice water, he'd start breathing laughing gas to get even higher. Or some kind of anesthetic gas type of thing. And then he told me that he would go into a state where he would leave his body and he would see a white light, and he would have an overwhelming desire to go toward that white light. And but he knew that if he didn't make a decision to return to his body, that he would die. And he told me, David, one day I'm going to make the decision to walk all the way into that white light. And then sometime after that, I think I was already into my residency at Highland Hospital. I was kind of a little out of the 60s wild era, but I learned that he had died while doing his thing there, and which was very sad. But it was a time where people were really putting everything on the line in order to find something, and that's what made the era so exciting. But it was sad that we lost him, because he was a very kindly person who gave so much to the community of that era. Well, any other questions or comments? Now, moving down on the list, there's another dimension is spiritual. Some of you may have heard my desert experience. Have you heard that? Raise your hand if you know that story. So there's just a couple. Those of you who have heard it, could you stand to hear it again? Because I have a lot of stories here that no one's heard. But one thing that I did in the 60s, I had so much growing up to do. I didn't know about dating or how to be sexy or, all different kinds of things. And I kind of adopted different mentors who would teach me whatever their special thing was. It wasn't any paid thing. It was just a kind of relationships I evolved with people. And one of them was Sergio Solvi, who was a psychodrama leader. And he was one of the very aggressive ones. And he was wild. He'd been a probation officer in Los Angeles. And then he came to the San Francisco area and got involved in psychodrama. But once we were having, people were believing pretty kooky things in those days, and still do. One day he was talking about, it was a kind of a silly theory, but that if you really want to experience God, or whatever word you want to use, that you had to go out into the desert. And he talked about, Moses went into the desert and Jesus went into the desert and for 40 days and 40 nights and fasted. And, Moses saw the burning bush and came back with the 10 Commandments or some such story. And he said the reason for that is because if you live in a city, God kind of comes down from the sky, but it gets diluted with all the people who want to receive God. But if you're out in the desert, then it all gets concentrated on you. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And I had to drive home from San Francisco to Phoenix. I can't remember why. It was something in the spring break. And so I decided to go through Nevada, because there's a lot of desert there, and that I camped out on the desert. I had a sleeping bag and just drove out on the desert and slept on the desert. And then the next day I was driving, and this sounds a little weird, but you remember how I saw that thing on that woman's face, and after the psychodrama marathon, when I'd been crying, and all of a sudden I looked up at the clouds while I was driving my VW Beetle, and I began to see the clouds turn multicolor. This was not a drug experience. And they started to have like sharp edges and forming patterns, beautiful patterns. And then I started thinking about different people I knew, my friend Howard Barney and his wife, and different people. And every time I thought about somebody, I know this sounds kooky, but I felt like I could suddenly see how they might be suffering and hiding it from people, like that there was some sad part about their life. And I started crying while I was driving, and I couldn't stop crying. And so this went on for many hours. I was just driving, and the clouds were just all multicolored, and I kept thinking about different people, and was sobbing, and but it felt joyous in a way to be aware of the suffering of other people, and it was like a celebration almost, and then I thought about this woman in our church. My dad was a minister, and there was this couple, and they used to invite us over for dinner after a church service on Sundays, because she was a tremendous cook, but she was also a very heavy alcoholic. And so when we'd go over to her house, she'd be staggering around and could barely walk, but she still managed to put together these beautiful meals. And Marion was her name, and her husband's name was John. He was a salesman. I remember he always wore these ties to church, and he knew how to tie the most beautiful knots in his ties. I never was able to figure out how to make such a perfect knot. But my dad told me, I said, why is she drinking all the time? And I think they were relatives of ours too, Scandinavian, because all of our ancestors came from Minnesota, from Sweden originally, and my dad said that they had always wanted to have a baby because they loved children, and their baby died at birth, and they were never able to have another baby, and that she'd been grieving that ever since. And I got to thinking about that, and I just was sobbing too at how much sadness she must have felt, and her husband John must have felt. And I had to stop and get something to eat. And even when I went into the restaurant, it felt like I could kind of sense the sorrow inside of the people in the restaurant. And it was hard not to, just erupt into tears, whenever I looked at anyone. And then as I continued driving, I was thinking, well, maybe this is kind of like a spiritual path that I should take on my life. This seems something, positive or meaningful. And then I had the idea came to me, no, that would be a mistake to do that with your life, because people will just think you're a nut, and it won't make any sense to anybody. But when you're old, then you can talk about these things, and then people will understand. But you have to do something practical with your life first, and so that's why I decided to continue with my residency in psychiatry. But the odd thing was that years later, when I was in Phoenix, I asked my dad, whatever happened to Marion? I won't mention her last name, and he said, oh, it was the oddest thing. One day, out of the blue, she just stopped drinking. I said, when was it? Do you know when it happened? He said it was the time that you were driving down from Stanford to Phoenix. So anyway, that's another weird story. But I think the I think that the thing that I learned a little bit there was that we have great techniques to help people, and team CBT is the most high-tech form of therapy ever developed, I'm pretty sure. We got over 100 techniques to help people change various kinds of distorted thoughts and relationship problems. But one thing Jill has taught me, and many of you have taught me, is that if you can combine that with real compassion that you convey to people, then you have a pretty unbeatable combination. And it also, the thing that seemed to occur to me is that if you can open up, then that's what the meaning of spirituality is, to feel the suffering of another person. And that if you do it, it's a joyous experience. And that's where I got the idea of sadness as celebration, and that's maybe when miracles become possible, or wonderful things become possible that aren't accessible with just purely secular techniques, without the love, without the compassion. And it also seemed to me at the time that God, which is a concept I don't even know what it means, but God comes to us through our suffering. That was the big message that I got, that to experience that suffering, that's what links us to the spiritual dimension, and that spiritual dimension is a healing and loving dimension, for whatever that's worth. It just sounds goofy and like crystals or whatever, but that was made quite an impact on me, and I've only told that story a few times since it happened way back in the 1960s, and certainly I'm not open like that all the time, but when tears do come to my eyes, to me it's always felt like a tremendous experience. So let's see. Would any comment or questions or anything on that one?
David, did you see her again when you said what happened to her, and then you were told that she stopped drinking after one of your visits? No,
it's just the time that I was driving across the desert. I was crying and thinking about her and just sobbing. And
yeah, and that was that was a strange experience, you're saying, because then it sounded like something like spiritually flowed from you to her.
Yeah, who knows?
Right,
but
right.
It was probably just a coincidence. But
Right.
I always wondered about that. And I think whenever you can, cry and have compassion, for someone who's hurting, it is a beautiful thing. And that the theme that I experience then is that there's a kind of loneliness in so many people. Probably many of us here tonight are inwardly feeling some loneliness or hurting about something. Like I know Rose, has a dad who is quite sick, and Rose has shed tears because she loves her dad so much, and I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do talk about it a lot here. This idea that just it's like a positive thing just to feel, right? Like, and so to feel for other people, and I think it's come up too, because sometimes, especially therapists who are I think newer to being a therapist, also, I mean, not that you're exactly touching on this, but like worry about even having tears in front of patients, and it's unprofessional. And of course we get feedback from our patients, I'll always know what makes them feel good and what doesn't. But I always share that in my experience, I'm pretty emotional and I'm easily brought to tears. And oftentimes I'm wiping my eyes during sessions with patients and have never had anyone complain about it. And to the contrary, I usually have people say it feels so good to feel so incredibly cared about, right? Or so seen or so heard or that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's beautiful, and you're lucky to have that that access to sadness and to tears. And I think the distinction between healthy sadness and depression is that the thoughts that are associated with healthy sadness are not distorted thoughts. Yeah. And depression results not from reality, but from distorted thoughts about reality. Marian, it was a fact that she had a tragic experience and was hurting inside. And that's why they were tears of celebration to suddenly understand her and what was going on to her, with her inside, and all the pain that she'd had.
And it looks like Kai has his hand up too.
Oh yeah, Kai.
Yeah, not a question, just a comment actually. I think it's so cool what you shared, David, because I heard this story on the podcast before. And I had an experience like that too. I would say about like close to eight or 9 years ago. And it was right after I broke up with my ex-girlfriend. And speaking of very powerful experiences, this is bringing up a lot of tears for me too, because back at that time I was kind of feeling miserable and lonely after my breakup. And so I just randomly picked up that book Siddhartha. I'm not sure if I'm pretty sure you've heard about
Siddhartha,
that one. Yeah.
It's one of my favorites. I've only read about 3 books in my life, and that's one of the 3.
Oh yeah. So it was a weird combination of things. Like I was lonely. I was in bed. I had just broken up with my ex-girlfriend, and I was feeling kind of hopeless and discouraged. And I was reading the book, and I was sick too. I had the flu, and I don't know what exactly came over me, but I was getting over towards the end of the book. There was the one part where Siddhartha, his son had come with him, involuntarily, because his wife had died of something, and he was trying to get his son to stay with him and be with him, but the son was so rebellious and didn't want to be with them and wanted to do his own thing, run off, and then the son did run off one day, and this caused a lot of sadness for Siddhartha. But he started talking about how he turned to the river, and he could hear the emotion of the river, and the river laughing, kind of feeling like the river was laughing, and then he kind of reached a point of enlightenment, because he realized how tragic it all was that his wife had died because a snake randomly bit her. And now he was stuck with a son that didn't even want to be with him. And then he remembered his own childhood, where he really hated everything that his father stood for, and that's why he decided to run away. And then all of it just came together, and he started laughing along with the river. And it was when I read that, I just instantly started to cry too, because it seemed like there was a lot of, it seemed like there was something that was just so simple and important in that message over there, that life is tragic. So many bad things happen. People die unexpectedly. Our kids, they move on. Everything keeps changing. But we're still alive, and we decide to live despite all that. And it was very beautiful at that time.
Yeah, wow.
It was so moving reading that.
Yeah,
and I don't
wow.
even know exactly why. After that day, when I read it, it kind of shifted my perspective, and I didn't feel quite as despairing or hopeless anymore. I still couldn't
didn't know what to do after that point in time. But I never had an experience like that ever. I wasn't on drugs or anything. I was just sick.
Right.
And it was so cool that you shared that, David, because I thought it was like going crazy at that time. So thanks for that, David.
Yeah. It's the does this expression "sadness is celebration" connect with you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just reading about how much Siddhartha had suffered and so many people had suffered, and yet the world moves on and people move on. It was such a profound thing.
Yeah.
It meant so much to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I can't understand it rationally, but I can understand it emotionally and experientially what you're saying, and it's really awesome. It's very touching. Yeah. I'm not sure what to do at this point. I've got a million more stories and radically different from these. But, but we could see if anyone else has ever experienced that sadness as celebration experience. Or I don't see any hands going up, but I appreciate what you said, Kai, because that was it. That was the experience.
I tried to tell one of my friends about it afterwards, and they were like, "Are you sure you're okay, Kai?" I was like, it got me really annoyed. I was like, "What the heck? I just told you something super important." So anyway,
that's why.
Sort of like what David said, though. It's experiential, right? It hit you in a way that you almost can't explain, and it sort of makes sense that it's hard to tell someone in words. So that they can actually understand your experience, right?
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
And that's what I thought too. If I talk about this too much, people are really going to think I'm a crazy Frank, psychotic or something. But yet, it was a really beautiful experience for me.
Yeah. David, Orly also has her hand up.
Oh yes, hi Orly. Thank you for putting your hand up. Yeah.
So, at least for me, from pretty early age, the desert was a place where I felt belong. And, if you really, since I was forced to learn the Bible with no religious context, you think about all the prophets. They all went to the desert to be inspired and creative. And nobody thought that they are crazy, actually. So I think that there is something in this void of the desert that gets you to be close mainly to yourself. I was in Utah, and all of a sudden I started screaming because I was so happy.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, and the leader of the hike was a little scared, but I said, "I'm sorry. I felt belong, And for me, as a teenager, feeling belong was just about everything I needed. So, the desert is a place for creativity and for some kind of you belong. If nobody rejects you, so to speak. So this is a very that story was really, I could identify with the emotions because of what I feel when I go to the desert. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I know that I'm so glad you spoke tonight, Orly. Should we go on to another round of stories, or what do you folks want to do at this point?
Let's hear more stories. David, is there anything, I just wanted to ask you, because I know you're sharing so much with us and being vulnerable and being the center of attention. Is there anything that you feel like you need from us? Like, are we interacting with you enough, or do you need more from us? I think to feel good about tonight.
Yeah, I think it's fine. It'd be fun to get some feedback from a couple more people, and maybe see, there's a lot more stories there, and see if there's ones that people would find there's 24 of them, and you
would like direction from us in a way.
Yeah. Which ones you might like to hear? Yeah, okay. Or what you're making of what you've heard so far. This is Jill Silverman.
Yeah, and this is my first time in the group, so I wasn't going to speak, but I am feeling inspired by your story. So I just wanted to share that as a teenager, when I was about 15 or 16, I was going to Gestalt groups. And it sounds very similar to what you were describing in terms of the encounters and the full-on kind of trying to break you open. And, I had some very mixed experiences about that. As you described it, sort of being aggressive. It did feel at times like there could be a very strong push, to push people to kind of break open in some way. And
frightening.
Yeah. And certainly at 16, it felt a little overwhelming being, with all of these adults. And they, there were things that were kind of kooky, like from, I guess, still held over, like trying to get to know people better by having them go eat lunch all naked together outside at these retreats. And I guess people were just really trying to find ways to be open. But I guess I wanted to say that one of the things that has drawn me to your work recently is I so appreciate the respect and empathy part of your work. I went on myself, I've been licensed for about 30 years. And at one point I worked in a drug treatment program that was one of these therapeutic communities that also tried to attack people and break them down and, make them sit on a bench if they were out of line, or just a little bit of shame and humiliation, that would be used to try to break people open. So I really didn't like that. I didn't feel good about that part of like when there was pressure to break open. But at the same time, there's a very powerful thing, yes, about opening up and letting go of that front. But I've just been really loving the balance of your work, of it being so engaging and people, sort of asking questions, but being so respectful, and also leading so much with empathy, and then also looking for kind of the positives in people's experience. Because I guess I don't know, my thought is like when people aren't feeling ashamed of what they're struggling with, then they open up naturally. Like what I'm finding is like, I love the part of trying to help people see what's positive about their negative thoughts, or even self-harming, or things that just seem like anybody would feel, like that they were being judged for. When you look for like, well, how is this helping you? And really, really see that, I just feel like people open up in a way that to me is feeling very profound, that is kind of different.
It's the key. It's the key to rapid change. It opens the door to rapid change. It removes the resistance. I love what you're saying. Thank you.
Sure.
David, it's Jill, other Jill. And hi, Jill, welcome to group. This is not our typical format, as you know, but I'm glad that you joined us. David, I can't believe I never, ever heard the story of where you met Melanie.
Well, we could start out with that one. At this Mid-Peninsula Free University had a coffee house on University Avenue. And it was really fun. And there was a bar like about 5 doors down on the corner, and then there was an old building, and I rented a room in that building to have a kind of pad. It was just a storage room, but it had a window overlooking University Avenue. And I made that kind of my pad. It only cost, I think, $30 a month to rent it, or something like that. And it was a cool building because a lot of pretty famous people were also renting rooms. Like, I don't know if heard of Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was he was a Stanford student, and he wrote this novel. It became a hit movie, and then he had his Merry Pranksters, and we'd be sitting in the student union. I don't know if you've heard of Neil Cassidy, but he was a speed freak, but a very famous, one of the early beatniks. And then he got into the kind of hippie type space. And Ken Kesey had these merry pranksters who would be, he'd be sponsoring these big LSD be-ins and things like that. And I remember once sitting in the student union, and he came wandering through with his merry pranksters. They were dressed in pajamas or clown uniform outfits. And Neil Cassidy was juggling hammers. And we felt like we were touched by God or something. They just seemed like ultra celebrities. It was amazing. And but at any rate, what my life became kind of was just tripping around all day, skipping classes, and just having fun, doing wild and crazy things. And life became an adventure. But one day I was I tried to spice up my image a little bit, and instead of being so nerdy and serious. And I bought, a friend had this Triumph motorcycle, a scrambler, and we used to go to the Oasis in Palo Alto and drink beers, and then we'd go out. I'd get on the back of it, and he'd drive it, and we would race sports cars through the hills. Type of thing. And it was very wild, but it was so exciting. And I eventually decided to take a year off of medical school, because I just didn't want to be in medical school at all. And so I bought his motorcycle, and I learned how to tune it, because I never knew how to do anything mechanically. He taught me how to tune the engine, and it was a British motorcycle, so poorly designed that it had to be tuned every week. It would get out of tune, but I was so proud that I could tune my motorcycle. So I drove my motorcycle down to the Mid-Peninsula Free University, and I was going in there and thinking, gee, it'd be really cool to meet someone. And I guess I had on this flashy purple brocade shirt, and I was wearing, boots, and thought I was looking pretty stellar. And so this young lady walked past, and I said, would you like a ride on my motorcycle? And she said she wasn't interested. And then Melanie, my current wife, thought she'd walk past and see if I would ask her. And so she walked past. I said, would you like a ride on my motorcycle? And she said, yeah, absolutely. And so she got on the back of my Triumph 500 Scrambler, and we drove over onto the Stanford campus and drove up. There was some kind of a quad thing where they had sporting events, and we kind of drove up on this hill, and she did some acrobatic maneuver, which I thought was really cool, like nothing advanced, but some cartwheel or something that I never would be able to do. And I thought, hey, she's pretty cool. I think she's for me. And about a week later, we decided to start living together. She was a high school dropout, and she was younger, 9 years younger. And we found a place to rent on Bryant Street in Palo Alto. It was behind a house. There was a kind of a parking lot behind the house. And there was a little hut there that was about maybe 10 feet wide and 20 feet long. And it had a stove and stuff in it. It didn't have a bathroom. But on the other side of the parking lot, there was an outhouse. And it had a shower in it and a sink. So that's where we went to take shower and stuff like that. And that place cost $10 a month to rent. And next to it, there was this big empty garage with a dirt floor. We had the fancy one, because we actually had a floor in our little hut that we were living in. And a friend of mine, Ken Long, he rented the one with the dirt floor, which was a huge empty garage, and he was living in there, and that's how I met my wife, and we just started living together, and then and tooling around on my motorcycle and just living our lives and doing kind of fun things. And then at some point she got pregnant, and I thought, okay, that's cool. And I finished medical school. I had no intention of going on to an internship. I took a second year off after medical school, and we ended up living down in Monterey and Pacific Grove, but we ran out of money and became homeless. And it seemed like we didn't have a care in the world. We would just, hitchhike around and ask people if we could sleep on their living room floor. And everyone was really, really nice. And then someone told us we could get on some kind of unemployment or something. So a doctor from the Carmel Hospital, arranged to deliver our baby, Senia. And and it was just like life was like a series of adventures. And when we were living down there, I knew that all I really wanted to do was counsel people. And so I used to go to the beach and meet people and counsel them, see if they had any problems, or I'd meet someone in a coffee house and offer them free counseling, because it was really the thing I'd always wanted to do. And but people weren't that interested. Some had some interest, but I guess it was weird, some person meeting you and offering to counsel you for free. And we just didn't have any money, hardly at all. And we were in this Indonesian Islamic cult called Subud, Subud. You can read about it, on the internet. And they practiced Ramadan. And I didn't know what any of this stuff was, but they had a chapter in Carmel Valley. So we were kind of interacting with that group, because I joined Subud thinking that would be a path to enlightenment, which it wasn't. But at any rate, they did this Ramadan thing, and I didn't know much what it was, but apparently, let's see, you can't, I think you have to fast in the daytime and you can only eat at night. Is that correct, if anyone knows?
That's right. I mean, there might be more clarification.
Yeah, that's from dawn to dusk, you have to fast even water.
Yeah. So we were doing that fasting, and we were sitting around a fire at night. And I said, well, what's the purpose of Ramadan? And if you pray, what are you supposed to pray for? And then someone says, oh, well, if you need like help with finances, or you don't have any money or worldly goods, then you can pray for that. And then Ramadan will provide for you what you need. And so I said, well, gee, I think I'll try that route, because we don't, we're just living from day to day, and our baby's about to be born, and like that. And then the next day I got the thought, I never wanted to do a psychiatric residency, because the image of psychiatry I got at Stanford was pretty bad. They seemed kind of stuffy and kind of authoritarianism, and it was pushing psychoanalysis or whatever they were pushing, and it didn't seem relevant. In fact, I even organized a kind of a 2-hour psychodrama at the medical school one evening on the title Psychiatry and Psychotherapy, Are They Relevant or Obsolete? And I invited Hussein Chung to lead it, and we invited people. I put a flyer for it under the door of every person in the psychiatry department, and we invited people from Palo Alto, and hundreds of people attended, but not one person from the Department of Psychiatry came to hear what Hussein Chung had to say. And of course, it was all about being emotional, being direct, making things happen with people. But where was I going? What was the?
I had asked how you met Melanie.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, so how did you? Melanie was when you met Melanie, she was a high school dropout, and so through after being with you, she finished her high school and college, and then graduate.
Well, when we had 2 children, we moved to Philadelphia from Highland Hospital my first 2 years to finish my residency, because I started working like crazy when I was a resident. I'd been a terrible medical student. I did just the opposite. I said, okay, I've got to do my internship and residency. I might as well just work really hard and become the best doctor I can be. And then when we moved to Philadelphia, she said, we had 2 children at that point, and she said, I think I'd like to, finish up college. I'd like to go to college. And then, so she went to Penn. She started out in nursing, but she didn't like that. Then she switched into psychology, and she became a top student. And it was amazing. She was doing that while raising our children at the same time. And she started at a community college, and then she switched to Penn and graduated near the top of her class. And so she got into the Penn PhD program in clinical psychology and did that also. And eventually we got married. Our daughter attended our wedding. One summer when we were vacationing in California, we used to go up to Tahoe, and we just got the impulse, why don't we actually get married? And so I knew of a Lutheran minister in Reno, and so we just, on the spur of the moment, decided to go into Reno and get married.
Wow.
And
so you were not married until you were back in California?
Yeah, well, no, we were still in Philadelphia, but we would visit California every summer when we were in Philadelphia, because her parents lived out here, and we loved it out here.
Yeah.
And it was just on one of our summer vacations.
Wow, that's a cool story.
Yeah, but anyway, that wasn't terribly dramatic, but that's how I met my wife, and we've been on the motorcycle ever since.
Right. That's really funny. Well, and you told a couple stories then through that, because there were a few more that I recognize. Let's see. Right? The encounter of the psychiatry and psychotherapy, are they relevant or obsolete?
Yeah, it was just a really awesome and encounter group at the medical school. But it was just one of the kinds of things that were happening all the time that we were attending or creating. I can tell you one kind of weird story. We tried. We're always trying to find some kind of spiritual path or psychological path. And one thing that was emphasized was that somehow you're supposed to express your feelings. That was the big theme of psychodrama and encounter. Everyone thought that's some kind of key to mental health. And so I decided to spend a week just wandering around Palo Alto and San Francisco, just sharing my feelings. And I decided to follow the rule that anything that I felt, I would say out loud. And I carried a tape recorder with me in case something awesome happened. So this really makes me sound like a lunatic, but I just wandered around saying exactly what I was feeling, and nothing very interesting or worthwhile happened until the last day of my experiment. I got back and I was in the Stanford Student Union, and I saw this fellow, and I had an immediate dislike for him. And he sat down, he gotten some food there to eat. And I walked up to him and I said, I just want you to know that I have extreme dislike for you. Well, the moment I looked at you, I instantly didn't like you. And he said, I'm not surprised. And I said, well, why aren't you surprised? He says, well, my picture was on the front page of the San Francisco Examiner newspaper this morning. I said, I don't read the newspaper. Why were you on the front page of the newspaper? He said, because I tried to bomb a building at Stanford, and I was arrested, and I'm probably going to be going to prison. And then he had this fantastic Navajo ring on. And I said, oh, I also want to tell you that I really like that ring that you're wearing. And he took it off. He says, here, you can have it. I'm not going to need it where I'm going. And he gave me this wonderful ring. But aside from that, I decided that just expressing your feelings is no magical key to mental health.
I don't know. It sounded like a pretty good, pretty interesting outcome in that occasion.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, are there any other requests people have looking at this? I'm feeling a little ridiculous right now, but.
Ooh, I love these stories, David. Can you share more dating stories? Mm-hmm. You always have good.
Yeah. Well, one that I have some trepidation about, but one of my things was being very, very nerdy, and I really wanted to learn how to get over that, and it was fun living in Palo Alto. You'd live in one house, and you hear there's another house where they have a vacant place, and if you had to move, so you had a lot of different experiences, and there was this fellow I became friends with named Jeff Evans, but he said he had the nickname Spider, and he was younger. He was about 19. And a really nice guy, and he was kind of poor as a church mouse. So he would, whenever I was living in a house, if they had a garage, then we'd let him make a pad in the garage so he could kind of live somewhere for free. And this was before I really got into the dating thing, and but he and I once decided to try to get over our fears of rejection, because he was I thought a pretty good looking guy, but he was so shy. He was just, always alone. And so we went out, and for 2 weeks, all day long, we went all around Palo Alto and San Francisco, trying to meet girls or women or whatever the correct word is. And we would just take turns and go up. And my mother had always told me, you have to be real sincere and polite. And so we would give our name and say who we were and try to get a phone number. And we were shot down 100% of the time. And we did about 15 a day. So we must have gotten shot down 150 times. And it didn't bring any love into our life, but it helped us at least get over our fear of rejection. And then I met this fellow who had a kind of a bad reputation. His name was Michael. And I talked about him in my book, Intimate Connections, but I disguised his name as William because I couldn't find him to get permission to use his real name. But he was someone that a lot of women would kind of look down on. He was kind of a womanizer. And for some reason, we developed a friendship. He said he was a mama's boy, and that he lived with his mommy, and he drove around on a motor scooter, and he worked at Macy's department store in the men's department. And the main thing he did was just walk around meeting gorgeous women and having sex. It sounds horrible, but that was his thing. And he seemed to be incredibly good at it. And I said, well, this might be evil, or this might be cool, but that maybe he would teach me a little bit about how he does what he does, because, I've got a lot to learn. And so he thought that was a cool idea. And so he took me into, Bloomingdale's and had me completely change my haircut and get all these clothes. He looked like a human lollipop. He was just dressed elegantly every moment, and he said, you have to dress beautiful clothes, and everything has to match. The shoes have to match the slacks, and they have to match the belt, that has to match the shirt, and the underpants have to match as well, and the materials. Like he was just totally integrated. And so he got me to get some of these outfits. And I felt so weird because I was wearing like stupid black shoes with slick bottoms and white socks and just looking really nerdy. And when I started wearing those kinds of clothes, women started looking at me for the first time, and it was kind of like a shock to the system. And then we would go around, and I would give him challenges like, this sounds probably fairly awful, but as a young man, you're filled with hormones and you're curious. And once I was standing in downtown Palo Alto, and I heard these two really attractive young ladies talking about him. And one of them says, well, that guy is disgusting. All he cares about is sex. And then the other one said, you're right. I wouldn't touch that guy with a 10-foot pole. And they seemed really angry and, determined. And just by coincidence, he walked right up. He just appeared, walked right up, put his arm around one of them, and off they went. And I could not believe it. And he seemed kind of like a Svengali or something. And I remember once I saw, we were together in downtown Palo Alto, and this woman, a really beautiful woman, drove up and stopped at the stoplight. I think she was in a Ferrari. It was a real expensive sports car. And I said, do you think you could pick her up right now? And he says, oh, sure, that's no problem. And he walked right out to the stoplight and said something to her. And she opened the door, he hopped in, and off they went. And I couldn't believe this. And so once I said to him, well, you seem to have some magical power. And, if I could just get 1/10 of that, I think I could spiff up my love life quite a bit. So he was determined to teach me the ropes. And I don't know why, but we just kind of became friends. I think he admired me because I was a medical student and, doing something serious with my life. But at any rate, I once asked him, I said, well, I see you picking up, beautiful girls all the time. And I've never seen you fail. How many do you think you could pick up all at once? Could you do more than one? And he said, oh, it's unlimited. I said, well, could you do 30? And he says, oh yeah, we can do that right now if you like. And I said, well, how would we do that? And he said, well, just spot someone who you think is really, really awesome looking or appealing or whatever, and then I'll show you. So we went up, and he said, oh, can we talk to you for a minute? And he said, we're thinking of making a movie, and we'd love to have you in our movie. Would you be interested? And she got all excited, and she said, well, what's the name of the movie? What's it all about? And I said, well, the name of the movie is Uptightness. We think people are too uptight. And so we're going to have a one-day happening and invite a lot of people to come, and we'll all take off our clothes and do crazy things and just have a really fun day. And she said, oh, I would love to participate in something like that. And so she gave us her phone number, and then we started just walking around asking people this, and every single person said, oh, yes, that's what I want to do. That sounds great. And then we met this young lady. She said, where are you going to what set are you going to use for your movie? You say, we haven't decided yet. She said, well, I just inherited a mansion at the top of one of the tallest hills in Los Altos Hills. And that'd make a great spot for your movie. And so I said, yeah, great, thank you. And she drew a map to her house. And then we got a bunch of copies made. And then we started handing out these to people. And we even would approach like a woman who's with her husband and invite her. And then they would say, well, should my husband come too? And say, well, he can drop you off and then pick you up at the end of the day. But, you know, we probably won't need him. And so she said, okay, yeah, I'll be there. And I mean, I couldn't believe what was happening. And then so we had a date set. And then I told some of my friends, you know, it's a movie, we got to have some movie cameras. And so if you have a Super 8, that was what people had in those days, it's called a Super 8 millimeter thing. And it didn't make sound, but it shot fairly good videos. So several brought Super 8 videos. And then someone said, you know, I know this guy, Larry Keenan, who does fantastic photography for magazine advertisements and TV ads. And he's one of the country's top photographers, and he's doing a thing on the hippies, and I bet he'd want to come and take pictures. So I say, yeah, tell Larry Keenan to come. We'd love to have him. So the day arrived, and all of these people started arriving, and I told a lot of my friends to come too, because a lot of them were kind of horny and they didn't know how to get dates and stuff like that, and so we want to have a balance there. And we also met a man, an elderly man, sitting on a bench, and we told him he looked uptight, and that we're going to make this movie Uptightness. We wanted him to come, and and so he even showed up, and then everyone just started taking off their clothes and looking. Doing fun, wild things. I had a friend came, Mark Jensen. He had been a real uptight engineer at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and he owned a Ferrari and had a wife in Portola Valley and a family. He was real rigid and uptight, and he turned on to LSD, and he completely gave up everything. His wife divorced him. He quit his job, and he became a beekeeper in Los Altos and sold honey through the local grocery stores for the rest of his life. But he came on his motorcycle, and we were naked on his motorcycle, and it was beautiful, flowers all around. It was a gorgeous setting. There was this kind of mansion, and that elderly man is probably about my age now, but he came, and we, and all these young ladies, they all took their clothes off, and everyone was taking their clothes off and just kind of doing be-in kinds of things. And my friend Spider started making out with this gorgeous young lady, and I don't think he'd had a date in 2 or 3 years, and it was just a fantastically happy day. And I have the photos. I actually made a movie out of it and showed it in a theater in Palo Alto, and a lot of people came. I just spliced it together at Stanford, the department of where they do movie training for the students, the graduate students. They let me use their equipment to splice this thing together. We had speakers all over on the lawn, playing our favorite, folk music and stuff like that. And it was just, people were just happy and dancing. And I learned the lighthearted side of life, that people are still children, and we all want to have fun. And that's part of sensuality. It's part of getting close to people, and that certainly our cup runneth over when from that day on, when it came time to having a lot of dates and having a lot of fun with people. And it was something that I had to learn. And it was hard for me because I was brought up in such a rigid, right-wing, conservatively religious orientation. When I was in seventh grade, they started having kissing parties, where you play spin the bottle. And I asked my mother if it was okay to do that. And she said, well, you can go to the parties, but you can't play spin the bottle or kiss the girls. And so I would go and just watch and feel really out of place and wish I could have fun too. And I finally learned to have fun. And but I found, somebody told me once, you should go to this place in San Francisco that, 20 years later, 25 years later, because there's a tremendous photography exhibit that you might want to see. It's in the top of a skyscraper. There's a kind of a lounge, and it's called The Hippies. And it's by Larry Keenan, some prize-winning photographer. And so we went up there, and here was all these photos from that day, except they were large, like 6 feet by 8 feet and stuff. Mm-hmm. And they were mind-blowing. And he also showed the proofs when I showed the movie in Palo Alto, and they were just, beautiful photos. And so I found them at his website. Sadly, he died, and the ones on his website were somewhat low resolution because he sold his work, and if you copy something off the website, you can't get the high resolution. But Stacy helped me find some of them, put them together in a little PowerPoint thing that I'm happy to show you. But some of you might, they're not, horrible or something, but they do show full male and female frontal nudity and really show them that elderly man came and shows these beautiful young women taking his clothes off, and he's just tickled and excited, and it captures some of the spirit of the 60s for sure, where every day was an adventure. And to me, today, every day is an adventure still. It's an adventure being with you folks. But if some of you might, we have such a multicultural and multi-religious group here, some of you might be on the Orthodox side or be shocked by these pictures. And so if you want, you can kind of, leave the group, because I don't want to upset anyone or hurt anyone's feelings. And I debated whether or not to show these photos. I was going to put them in my book, Intimate Connection, because they are absolutely stunning photos. But my editor, Maria Guarnaschelli, says, no, if you put these in there, your career will be ruined because you have a fatherly image. And this is too racy. But one thing I learned is that to find sexuality, to find love, to find connection. And this is one of the things I taught. Treating single men and women who couldn't get into the dating scene and who were lonely. That was my top thing to treat during my career. And it's because of the things I learned from Michael and from these experiences that I was able to pass on and help people find their sexy side. But one thing I had to learn that was hard for me at first is that I was too nice, and that was turning people off. And it wasn't true what my parents said about what attracted people to each other. And I learned that I had to become maybe a little bit more on the bad side. And once I did that, suddenly I found that people were very attracted to me. And that's a hard lesson to learn, because it seems wrong. But Carl Jung talked about that, integrating with your shadow, accepting all of yourself. And that those lessons that I learned that day when we made that Uptightness movie has been the most valuable thing for me, and helping, hundreds of lonely, desperate people who just, didn't know how to play the game a little bit. Another cool thing that happened, this couple came, this woman was a fairly famous model at the time, Kai de Fontenay, and she came with her partner, who was also a famous model. And they came dressed to the hilt in like designer clothes. And they also brought their poodle, a real fancy poodle. And it was like a Federico Fellini movie, with them standing next to this mansion. And it was just a fantastic day. And it's just like you can make magic happen if you're creative and open. But it was really the one of the most wonderful periods of my life. Yeah. But yeah, it was a fantastic time. I went to the original Human Being and Golden Gate Park, where Timothy Leary said, "Tune in, turn on, and drop out." And there were tens of thousands of people there, and it was really a historic occasion. And it was just a time of adventure. But again, we have adventures every Tuesday. And when you and I work with people doing personal work, Jill, it's some of the most beautiful moments of my life.
And mine too.
So, folks, any questions or comments?
David, I have been in wonderful sessions with you for so many years. I don't know if we can talk this way.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Mark. I love you. Yeah, I so much appreciate you. Yeah, you've been coming to the group for the longest time, and you've always been made such kind comments and come on so many hikes, and we've shared so much, and it's meant a lot to me. You mean a lot to me.
Thank you.
What do you think, Jacob?
Tonight was just magical. I loved the stories with the tears, and those were beautiful and touching, and loved all the stories about dating and Melanie, and just a really special, awesome evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
And David, along those lines, we should say, thank you for trusting us with your stories and for sharing so much of yourself with us, and for sharing your tears and just sharing a very different, vulnerable side and personal side of yourself, which I think means a lot to me. And I know from everyone's comments that it means a lot to everyone else here too. And that you trust us to be able to share some of these racier stories, as you said.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I loved telling you, and if it goes well, I might slip in some more stories from time to time. But it was just a fantastic time to be alive. But this is also a fantastic time to be alive, with a lot of the same turbulence politically that we were experiencing then with the Vietnam War and the protests. And I got arrested during one of the protests and escaped from the police, and it was just a very exciting period. And I think that this, but I think the beauty is what you've all shared and made happen here with this fabulous weekly group where miracles happen pretty regularly too. And so thanks you, all of you. Thanks, Jill, for all of that you've given me, Jill, which I've appreciated. Okay, good night. Love you all.
All right, good night. David.
Thanks, David.
Good night.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, the director of the Feeling Great Therapy Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good Podcast.